Yeah, I'm Brian Fox. I'm a free software advocate, and I'm about 800 years old. Yeah, no, I'm not quite that old. I'm here to talk about the role of technology in democracy, but mostly I'm here to talk about what I think is really important is that open source can help. Thank you. Open source can help people with communication, and with learning, and with advancing the world. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, if I can. There we go. In 1984, Richard Stallman had an idea to create a free version of an operating system, and he picked Unix because that was the current system at the time, the one that was exciting for people. And in 1985, I started working with Richard Stallman. I was the first employee at the Free Software Foundation. We got excited and started working on this project called GNU. Richard had already released the first version of an editor called Emacs, and he had a working compiler called GCC, and these were the two most important components of a completely free operating system. While I was with the Free Software Foundation, I created a bunch of software. I think we've heard that I created the Bash shell. I also wrote the readline library, which is widely used, the history library, make info, these are documentation systems, a thing called Finger. I maintained Emacs for several years. And then, once again, I did lead the implementation of a prototype election system in 2008. The design of the system was Alan Deckert's, and the person who did most of the programming was Parker Abercrombie. Some people here know him because he used to work with what's now called Opus Logic. In 2017, I co-founded a company called Orchid Labs with the goal of bringing back to the internet what it used to be, surveillance-free, censorship-free, and a way for people to communicate. I'm currently advising blockchain companies on open source strategies. So I do have some core beliefs, and I hope that most of these are shared. I'm not really sure if they are or not, so we'll find out. I think society is built on the sharing of ideas. That without that, you're just a person by yourself and nothing interesting happens. If you're not able to share your thought processes, your belief systems with another person, you're not creating a society and you're not giving yourself a chance to further humanity. Source code, like mathematical algorithms, is the expression of specific ideas. Does everybody know what source code is? Okay, so if you have an application on your computer like Word or Pages, you're using what's called the binary. You're using something it's the application. It actually allows you to do things. The way that application came into being was somebody wrote down the ideas, the rules for how that thing should behave, and the stuff they use to write the rules down is called source code. The source code is usually readable by a human being. Sometimes it has to be readable by a programmer, but lately, over the past 20 or 30 years, the computer science community has been trying very hard to make it readable by essentially anyone. So without source code, software is just a result. It's like saying without mathematical formulas, all you have is the answer. So if I just say 4, that doesn't tell you anything, and if I say 2 plus 2, you have some idea of my process to get to 4. And so that's what source code does for you. And of course, the way we move forward in society and the way we move forward as humanity is to build upon what has come before. The amount of information a 7th grader knows today is more than I knew when I was leaving high school. So when people think about technology and society, I think they usually think about something like this. Guys at conferences hacking, maybe they're at DevCon in Osaka. But I actually think about it like this. I think about how this person couldn't communicate with other people before he had a cell phone in his hand. I also think that the cigarette company couldn't have gotten him a cigarette without technology. That's a separate issue. Or these people sitting on a beach somewhere in the middle of Africa. Well, not in the middle, I guess. So I think those things are important. But the essence of this is, I think the thing that technology brings to people is communication. And that's the thing that makes a society a society. People talk about technology and they think about automation. Gee, we have a better factory now. Is AI going to take all our jobs away? How can I get this job done without me doing any personal labor? I think those things are there. That's true. I'm glad I have a microwave to make my food hot quickly. But I'm much happier that I have an internet and I can communicate with people across the planet about ideas that I have in common with them or about making new ideas. So I see technology as a community building tool. Parents can now communicate with other parents, no matter where they are, in a way that they couldn't before, in a much richer way. So if your parents live in Massachusetts and you live in Southern California, you got a brand new baby, don't worry, you can talk to them every day and show them your baby every single day and get information every day. So maybe it's not always the best thing. But it's always about the sharing of ideas, even when it's just applied directly to something like a football game. These people are talking about the plays they're going to do, and there's communication with the owner, and there's communication with all the people that are involved in this effort. It's also the dissemination of information. With the current impeachment hearings, I'm certain everyone is a little bit up to speed on that at the minimum, and it's because technology is providing that information, whether you, like me, watch YouTube videos in the middle of the night, or whether you sit in front of your TV and watch C-SPAN all day. So how is this relating to democracy? I think that the use of technology is the thing that enables individuals to make informed choices. So a society is made up of its individual components. Those components need to understand how they can live with each other, maybe make some rules for interaction or some guidelines. For that to happen, there has to be some kind of discussion and there has to be information flow back and forth. The more technology we apply to this problem, the more that's capable the more individuals are capable of getting that information and making informed choices. I talked about your parents being in Massachusetts and you being here. That's the idea of removing locality as a barrier to discussion. I don't only have to speak with my neighbors, although I do recommend that you speak with your neighbors, by the way. Don't just look on Facebook. Talk to the guy next door about the garbage can. It's a good idea. But that shouldn't be the only way that you can have this discussion. It's great to get information from people in other parts of the world. Talk to somebody in Somalia and tell them how upset you are that your water isn't working as well, your water pressure isn't as good as it should be. And listen to what they tell you. You'll learn some things. So it's also important to really understand the choices of the community as a whole, and also the choices of what the individuals want, so that you can make a society that works for yourself, for your group, and for other individuals. If you're a responsible technologist, you do some of these things. You work on things that make society better as a whole. You think about that while you're working. You do not think only about the gold mine that Facebook might be. You think very specifically about, is what I'm doing something that could be used to better society? You think about the quality of life and humanity. You don't want your parents to be very old and in a room by themselves and unable to communicate with anybody else. You want to make sure that the things you do are enabling better quality of life for everyone, including yourself. And the word next in this next piece is supposed to be very large. Something got lost in translation. So try to understand and pay attention to the fact that the next thing you build is going to be better. The next thing that your neighbor builds or your friend builds or somebody else you know builds will be better than the thing you're building. You're not building the end thing. You're just adding incrementally to what we have as a society, what we have for technology as a society. And don't think that the thing you're building is, in fact, the next great thing. You have to understand, you would not be building that if it wasn't for the people who came before you. So be humbled by them and be inspired by them. They've done fantastic things and we're all benefiting from it now. So I'm going to talk really quickly about election systems. In America, we like to think that our vote is counted as cast. And when you go to the polls and you say, I want to vote for X, that someday, somewhere, it says another person voted for X. And so in order for that to happen, the entire process has to have transparency and integrity, and you have to trust in that process. If we're using proprietary closed source software, software in which you cannot see the instructions and the rules which make up the application, if we are using that, we're not actually providing ourselves with transparency and openness and a way to make sure our votes are counted as cast. So a software company that makes this closed source software, that company has a legal fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And their shareholders are not the sum total of the users of that software. We're the users of that software when we go to cast our votes, and we might not be shareholders in that company. So why would I let a company whose incentives, whose drivers are not the same as mine, make the software, the application I use in order to get my vote to be counted as cast? There are other problems that exist with proprietary software versus open source software, closed source versus open source software. Proprietary software has a limited number of people that can audit or debug it. So I own a company and I've hired 100 programmers and they all work on this application called the voting machine. And then we have a voting machine and it's great, right? And 100 people looked at it. Well, that's nothing compared to the thousands and thousands of people that might have looked at it if it was open source and might have found those bugs and might have fixed those bugs in advance. So even if the company's not doing anything malicious, they can be making a mistake. When they make that mistake, somebody needs to catch it. And the only people who are going to catch it are the people who work at the company, and their goal is to keep their jobs. So it's not that great when you're a programmer and you say, I made another mistake, I made another mistake, I made another mistake. That doesn't keep your job very well. The programmers who work for proprietary companies are not heavily incentivized to find bugs in the software that they write, which is why there are things like QA departments and pair programming and other programmers that can find the bugs that guy's code, get him in trouble. So, lastly, but not least, the proprietary software doesn't belong to the society as a whole. It belongs to the company that made it. But we are the people who have to use it, and we are the end users of this application, and we care about the output and the results of that. So open source election systems are the answer. Open source election systems means that all the software that goes into anything that touches, any software that touches an election, whether you think that there should be a lot or a small amount, any amount of software that touches the election system should be completely open so that anybody can look at it, understand it, critique it, maybe offer code to make it better. We can get as many eyeballs on it as there are people who care about it. And if we're talking about election systems here in the US, there's a lot of people who care about it. If we're talking about election systems across the world, there are even more people who care about it. Open source election systems, they have no other goal than counting the votes as cast. There is no profit motive in it. There is no competition. There's no reason to compete. All we're trying to do is make sure we have the best system we can make for counting votes as they were cast. And open source election systems belong to the society as a whole, not to any one firm or function or proprietary essence in it. So you know when you're using an open source election system, well, it was made by you, for you, so that your vote can be counted. If you're a technologist, you have a job, you have a role that you should do. Make sure you're going to do good, not bad. Now, you can't control the use of every single technology. I mean, explosions have benefits and they have detriments. So it's okay with me that you made something explosive. But think about how you can use your thing for good and try to align yourself with the good side. There's plenty of people who will find the bad thing you can do with technology. Be aware that as you create things, you actually are wielding some power. So acknowledge that you have that power and then try to use that power in a way that makes life better for people, not worse. And if you can do that, you can help other technologists to do as you do. And we can end up with something useful like an open source election system or democracy that works. Thanks. I think I got 5 minutes. So. If there's any questions at all, I'm happy to answer. I see. Yes, sir.
I think Wikipedia is considered open source, but it's something to open source is sometimes subject to alteration. They're called derivative works sometimes in open source. But how do you prevent malicious modifications?
There's a common misconception that just because source is open, that anybody can modify it. What it really means is anybody has the capability to offer modifications. It doesn't mean that anybody can simply modify the software that you're using. So people make suggestions and they say, we think that the software, we've looked at the software and we think that there's some logic errors here, or that you've left out a possibility that needs to be looked at. And here's what we call a patch, some software, some source code that can make this better. You, the maintainer of that software, which could be a community or a group of people who care about managing that software, can vote on whether or not to accept that patch and put it into the software as a whole. Another thing that's true about open source, which is kind of important, is let's say that there's an open source election system and you've got your best buddy who's a great technologist to look at it, and he says this thing's fantastic just the way it is. And you go, great, I'm going to use this, when I run my little election, I'm going to be using this software. And the software goes through some updates in the meantime. You're not sure you like those updates. It's okay, you can still use the version that you said you liked without any changes whatsoever, even though there might have been additional software additions made to it. You can say, I don't want those, I want the one that I looked at before. So open source does not force you to do something, and it does not allow people random willy-nilly to add software to the actual product. Yes, sir.
So I think I have the next question. So on a practical level, then given that governments usually have a whole bidding process, it's pretty arduous and complex, how does an open source solution get into that process so that it actually gets used? Are there advocates for it? Is there a company attached to it? What's it look like?
So ultimately, like any application, an open source application has to add value to the people who might use it. So it does, in a sense, compete with other solutions to a specific problem. If you write a piece of software that nobody needs, nobody will use it. But if you write a piece of software that people care about, like a free version of an operating system called Unix, which then became called Linux, and all the code that's in that system is completely open source and free, then it gets incredibly wide adoption. And it spawns things like Mac OS X, which used to be built on free software, and they're now trying to remove some of that software from their system. And it spawns things like Microsoft PowerShell, which is based on Bash. And the utility of what was built is of high enough quality that people actually want it. Maybe I missed your question.
Yeah, so then would the companies that are in that bidding process choose to adopt your open source solution and they're actually bidding with the government? Or is there an advocate of the open source code that's going to be in that bidding process so that these governments that have elections will actually start to use your solution as opposed to the proprietary solution?
The answer to your question is kind of detailed. I'll just brush on it really quickly. It depends on the license that is used. I advocate for GPL v3 or AGPL, for those of you who know the difference, but I advocate for a license that says this software is 100% open source free software. If you add something to it, you have to contribute that back to the community. So what that means is a company can pick it up and add something to it that the additions get contributed back to the community. The company can sell service and support for that thing they're building. I don't have a problem with capitalism and service and so forth, but because it's been contributed back to the community, this guy over here can use the version that he likes to run the election he wants to run, and it's not required to buy it from that company. That helped, right? Okay, I guess maybe one more question, I gotta give this up.
Do you think that there is room in your values for good technology for proprietary software, or do you think that all software should be open source?
I believe all software should be open source.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.